I was there when the prayers stopped. Not all at once, you understand. Faith does not die like a man dies, with a final breath and a cessation of movement. Faith dies like a garden dies when the gardener forgets it exists slowly, section by section, until you look up one day and realize you are standing in a wasteland. I was a chronicler tertius in the Administratum's Department of Ecclesiastical Compliance, stationed on a hive world whose name I will not write because I am not certain it still exists in any meaningful sense. My duty was simple, as all duties in the Emperor's service are simple. Monitor prayer attendance, track tithe compliance to the ecclesiarchy, and report deviations to my superiors. For 37 years I performed this duty without complaint, without question, watching the numbers flow past my desk like the slow turning of a great wheel. The numbers were always the same. You see, that was the comfort of it. 17 million souls in Hive Primus alone, and every one of them required to attend prayer services 3 times per week minimum. The tallies came in from the parish administrators. I compiled them into reports, and those reports went up the chain until they reached someone important enough to care. I never questioned the numbers. I never thought to question them. They were as constant as the recycled air we breathed, as inevitable as the darkness between the stars. I had a small cubicle on the 412th floor of the Administratum Tower, with a narrow window that looked out over the sprawl of the Hive City. Sometimes, when my eyes grew tired from the data slates, I would stare out that window and watch the processions moving through the streets below, rivers of humanity flowing toward the cathedral spires, their voices rising in hymns I could not hear but knew by heart nonetheless. My wife had died 7 years before the prayers stopped. Our daughter had been taken by the Schola Progenium when she showed an aptitude for remembering the Imperial catechisms. I lived alone in a hab unit the size of a coffin, and I was content. Contentment, I had learned, was the highest aspiration for someone of my station. It meant you were not being punished, not being investigated, not being dragged before an Arbeitstribunal or an inquisitorial court. It meant you had managed to become invisible, which in the Imperium is the closest thing to safety. The first anomaly appeared on a 5th-day morning, 3 months into the fiscal quarter. I remember because I had just received my monthly ration of real caffeine, not the synthetic substitute that tasted like burnt rubber and industrial solvent, but actual caffeine extracted from plants grown in some distant agri-world's greenhouses. I was savoring my first cup in weeks when I noticed the discrepancy in the attendance reports from Parish 17 Gamma. The numbers were down by 3%, not a catastrophic deviation, but enough to warrant a note in my daily summary. I flagged it, made the appropriate annotation, and moved on. The next week, the shortfall was 7%. The week after that, 12%. Other parishes began showing similar patterns. I compiled my reports with increasing unease, noting the trend lines, the geographic clustering of the deviations. Something was spreading through the hive like a disease, but it was a disease of absence rather than presence. People were simply not attending services. My superiors sent me a terse vox message. Investigate and report. Do not escalate until you have actionable intelligence. I descended into the mid-hive levels, with a pair of Administratum enforcers, not Arbeits, just low-grade security personnel with shock mauls and an inflated sense of their own authority. We went to Parish 17 Gamma first, because it had shown the earliest signs of deviation. The priest administrator was a haggard man named Corvus, who looked like he had not slept in weeks. His eyes were ringed with dark circles, and his hands trembled when he poured recaf from a battered brass urn. The smell of incense in his office was overwhelming, as though he had been burning it continuously to cover some other odor I could not quite identify. They just stopped coming, he told me, his voice barely above a whisper. At first it was a few here and there, people we could write off as sick or detained by work obligations, but then it was dozens, then hundreds. I sent notices. I sent enforcers to their hab units. Some of them came back once, maybe twice, but then they stopped again, and the ones who do come. He trailed off, staring into his recaf as though it held answers he was afraid to find. What about the ones who come? I prompted, my stylus poised over my data slate. Corvus looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen in a priest before. It was not fear. Exactly. It was something older and colder than fear. They don't pray anymore, he said. They come to the services. They sit in the pews. They go through the motions. But when we call for the hymns, most of them just sit there, silent, watching. And the ones who do sing, they sing the wrong words. I felt a coldness settle in my stomach, but I kept my face neutral. Wrong words? Not heretical words, Corvus said quickly, as though afraid I would summon an inquisitor on the spot. Just wrong. Off by a syllable here, a verse there, like they're trying to remember something they once knew but have forgotten, or like they're singing a song that sounds like the hymn but isn't quite the same. He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. Last week, during the Litany of Faith, half the congregation sang a verse I have never heard before. It rhymed correctly. It fit the meter. But it was not in any approved hymn book. When I asked them about it afterward, they looked at me like I was the one speaking nonsense. They insisted they were singing the proper words. They insisted I was the one who had changed the hymn. I noted this in my data slate, though my hands were less steady than I would have liked. Has this been reported to the ecclesiarchy proper? Corvus laughed, a sound like glass breaking. I have sent 17 Vox messages. I have filed formal reports. I have requested an investigation from the Cardinal's office. Nothing. Silence. Either they think I am insane, or they are seeing the same thing in other parishes and do not want to admit it. We left his office without the actionable intelligence my superiors demanded, but with a knot of unease in my chest that would not loosen. Over the following weeks, I expanded my investigation, visiting parishes across multiple districts. The pattern was everywhere, spreading like frost across a window. Attendance was collapsing. Those who still came to services were going through the motions with the mechanical precision of servitors, empty of genuine devotion. And everywhere, there were reports of the hymns being wrong, the prayers being subtly altered, the very words of faith shifting like sand beneath the feet of the faithful. I began to notice it in my own life as well. The public Vox hymns that played in the transit stations every morning, I could not quite remember the words anymore. They sounded right, felt right, but when I tried to sing along, the syllables caught in my throat like fish bones. I found myself staring at the aquila tattooed on my left forearm, the double-headed eagle that every imperial citizen receives at birth, and wondering if its proportions had always been so strange. Were the heads always angled at quite that degree? Were the wings always so asymmetrical? I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of the investigation was affecting my perceptions. But the doubt, once planted, grew roots. 3 months after I began my investigation, my superior summoned me to his office on the 903rd floor. His name was Proctor Maximal Thorn, and he was a man of such rigid orthodoxy that rumor claimed he had once flagged himself for a minor prayer deviation and subjected himself to a week of corrective penance. His office was a cathedral in miniature, every surface covered in purity seals and devotional inscriptions. The smell of incense was so thick I could taste it on my tongue. "Your reports are troubling, chronicler," he said without preamble. He did not invite me to sit. "The trends you have identified are significant." "Yes, Proctor," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "I believe the situation warrants escalation too." "The situation warrants nothing," Thorn interrupted, his voice sharp as a lash. "Nothing except continued monitoring and documentation. You will expand your data collection. You will identify the rate of deviation, the geographic spread, the demographic factors. But you will not escalate. You will not speak of this to anyone outside the department. And you will not draw conclusions. Is that clear?" I stared at him, momentarily speechless. "Proctor, if this is some form of heretical movement, if the people are losing faith..." "Faith is not lost," Thorn said flatly. "Faith cannot be lost. The Emperor's light is eternal, and humanity's devotion is the pillar upon which the Imperium stands. What you are documenting is merely a temporary fluctuation, a statistical anomaly that will correct itself in time. To suggest otherwise is to question the very foundation of our civilization. Do you question that foundation, chronicler? The threat in his words was unmistakable. I lowered my gaze. No, Proctor. Good. Continue your work. Report your findings. But remember your place. He dismissed me with a gesture, and I fled his office with my data slate clutched to my chest like a shield. But I could not let it go. The truth was there in the numbers, in the empty pews and the altered hymns, in the eyes of priests like Corvus, who were watching their flocks evaporate like morning mist. Something was happening to humanity's faith, and whatever it was accelerating. I began compiling my data in secret, creating reports that would never go up the official chain. I mapped the spread of the deviation like a plague doctor mapping an outbreak, watching the red zones expand across my projections of the hive city. In 6 months, half the parishes showed significant attendance drops. In 9 months, 3/4. And always, the reports of the hymns being wrong. I started visiting the lower hive levels. The places where the administratum's reach grew thin, and the structures of imperial authority crumbled into something more primal. Down there, in the underhive where the lights flickered, and the air tasted of rust and desperation, I found something I had not expected: indifference. The people I spoke to, the gangers, the factory workers, the destitute masses who lived on recycled protein and hoped they did not hate the Emperor. They did not rail against his teachings or burn his icons. They simply did not care anymore. When I asked them about prayer services, they looked at me with blank incomprehension, as though I were speaking a foreign language. When I showed them the Aquila, the symbol that had governed their lives since birth, they nodded politely, but their eyes were empty of recognition. Used to go to services, one woman told me. She was missing 3 fingers on her left hand, casualties of factory work, and her face was lined with exhaustion. Every 2nd day and 7th day, regular as clockwork. But one day I just stopped. Didn't decide to stop. Didn't feel angry or rebellious. Just woke up and realized I had better things to do. More important things. Actual things, you know. And the Emperor. She paused, her brow furrowing as though trying to remember something from long ago. The Emperor is far away. Up there in his palace, on his throne. What's he ever done for me? For any of us? I should have reported her. Should have marked her for re-education or investigation. Instead, I thanked her and moved on, because I knew with a certainty that made my bones ache that reporting her would accomplish nothing. She was not an outlier. She was not a heretic. She was simply the future, the inevitable end of the trajectory I had been tracking for months. Humanity was not turning away from the Emperor in rage or rebellion. Humanity was forgetting him, forgetting that he mattered, forgetting why they had ever believed in the first place. I began to have dreams. In them, I stood in a vast cathedral, but the cathedral was empty. No priests, no congregation, no hymns, just silence and the echo of my own footsteps on the stone floor. I would walk down the center aisle toward the altar, where a massive statue of the Emperor stood with his arms outstretched. But as I got closer, I would see that the statue was not made of stone or gold. It was made of paper, thin and brittle, and it was beginning to crumble. Pieces would flake away, drifting down like snow, and I would try to gather them, to hold them together, but they would dissolve in my hands like ash. I would wake from these dreams with my heart racing, my hab unit dark and close around me, and I would lie there wondering if the dreams were warnings or predictions, or simply my mind breaking under the weight of what I had seen. The Imperium did not acknowledge the crisis, or perhaps it could not acknowledge it, because to do so would be to admit that the foundation was cracking. I continued to compile my reports, watching the numbers plummet, watching the geographic spread of indifference consume district after district. And then, approximately 1 year after I had first noticed the anomaly in Parish 17 Gamma, something changed. The tithes stopped coming. Not the economic tithes, those still flowed, because the administratum has ways of ensuring compliance that do not rely on willing cooperation, but the spiritual tithes, the offerings made to the ecclesiarchy, the donations to the priests, and the shrines they dried up overnight. Parish budgets collapsed, priests began to go unpaid, cathedral maintenance ground to a halt, and then, inevitably, the priests themselves began to stop showing up. Some fled to other worlds, seeking positions where faith still held sway. Others, simply, left, abandoned their vestments and their vows and walked away, disappearing into the hive's teeming masses like drops of water into an ocean. I attended a service at the Grand Cathedral of St. Macarius, the largest shrine in Hive Primus, on what would turn out to be its final day of operation. The cathedral could hold 50,000 worshippers, but on that day there were perhaps 200. They sat scattered through the pews like debris after a flood, small and isolated and silent. The priests went through the liturgy with mechanical precision, their voices echoing in the vast empty space. When it came time for the congregation to respond, fewer than half bothered. The rest just sat there, staring at nothing, waiting for it to be over. I left before the final benediction, unable to bear it any longer. Outside, the streets were full of people going about their lives, working, trading, arguing, living, as though nothing had changed, as though the death of faith was no more significant than a change in the weather. I walked back to the Administratum Tower through crowds that had once stopped to make the sign of the Aquila when a procession passed, who had once bowed their heads in reverence at the ringing of the cathedral bells. Now they simply walked, their faces turned toward their own concerns, the great machinery of the Imperium grinding on around them without the animating spark of belief. The Vox messages from other worlds began to arrive shortly after that. At first, they were isolated reports, easily dismissed as local problems or communication errors. But the pattern was unmistakable. Agri-worlds reporting drops in prayer compliance. Forge worlds where the tech priests of the Mechanicus noted a decline in worship of the Omnissiah. Mining colonies where the workers had stopped attending daily benedictions. Everywhere, across thousands of worlds, the same story. Humanity was losing faith. Not all at once. Not in fire and rebellion. Just slowly forgetting why faith had ever mattered in the first place. And then the other reports began to arrive. The ones that made my blood run cold. Ships lost in the warp, not destroyed lost. They entered the Immaterium and simply never emerged. The rate of loss was escalating, far beyond normal warp travel attrition. Navigator houses reported anomalies, their seers speaking of the Astronomican growing dim. The Emperor's light, the psychic beacon that had guided humanity through the warp for 10,000 years, was fading, not extinguished not yet, but dimming, its beam contracting, its reach shortening. Worlds on the Imperium's fringes, far from holy terror, reported losing contact with the Astronomican entirely. They were navigating by dead reckoning now, by charts and prayers, by hope. I tried to compile these reports into a coherent summary, to create a document that would force the administratum to acknowledge the crisis. But every time I approached my superiors, I was shut down. Unconfirmed rumors, statistical anomalies, temporary fluctuations. The denial was absolute and unyielding. The Imperium could not admit that faith was dying, because the Imperium was built on faith. Without it, what were we? Just scattered worlds in the darkness, alone and afraid and waiting for the monsters to notice we had stopped believing in the light. I was working late one evening, my cubicle lit only by the glow of my data slate, when I received an unexpected Vox message. The encryption was military grade, the kind used by the Imperial Guard or Naval Intelligence. When I decrypted it, the message was brief. Report to Sublevel 47, Section Gamma, 0300 hours. Come alone. Bring your research. I should not have gone. Every instinct, every lesson learned in 37 years of service, screamed that this was a trap or a test, but I went anyway, because by that point I was desperate for anyone to acknowledge what I had seen. I descended into the sub-levels of the Administratum Tower, past layers of security and through corridors that grew progressively older and more decrepit. Sublevel 47 was ancient, predating the current tower structure by centuries. The walls were bare rockcrete, the lights flickering and dim. The air tasted of mold and forgotten things. Section Gamma was a conference room that looked like it had not been used in decades. Inside, I found 3 people. An inquisitorial acolyte whose face was hidden behind a rebreather mask, a naval intelligence officer with the hollow eyes of someone who had seen too much, and a tech priest whose augmetics covered most of their body. They did not introduce themselves. They did not offer explanations. They simply gestured for me to sit and present my findings. I spread out my data slates, my charts, my compiled reports. I walked them through the collapse of prayer attendance, the geographic spread, the rate of acceleration. I showed them the reports from other worlds, the pattern of warp losses, the dimming of the Astronomican. I laid it all out with the precision of a prosecutor presenting a case. And when I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. The naval officer spoke first. "The Navis Nobilite believes the Emperor is dying." The words hung in the air like a curse. The tech priest's mechadendrites twitched, servos whirring. The acolyte said nothing, but I could feel their gaze through the mask. "The Golden Throne is failing," the officer continued, their voice flat and emotionless. "The Mechanicus has known for centuries, but the rate of degradation is accelerating. The tech priests can no longer guarantee it will last another millennium, perhaps not even another century. The Emperor's psychic presence is weakening, and as it weakens, humanity's connection to him weakens as well. Faith is not dying because people are choosing apostasy. Faith is dying because the object of that faith is slipping away." I felt the room spin around me. "But the Imperium? If faith dies, the Imperium will follow," the acolyte said, their voice a harsh rasp through the rebreather. "This is not prophecy. This is extrapolation. We have seen it beginning. Worlds losing contact, sectors descending into anarchy, the great tithes failing, the institutions crumbling, and at the heart of it all, the slow death of a god who has kept humanity together for 10,000 years through sheer force of will and belief." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because you have seen the truth," the tech priest said, their voice a synthesized monotone. "Because your data confirms what we have suspected. And because we need chroniclers. When the Imperium falls, and it will fall, chronicler, make no mistake, we need people who have documented how it happened, so that those who come after, if any do, will understand that this was not sudden. This was not betrayal or invasion or catastrophic war. This was the inevitable consequence of a faith built on sand, on the lie that a dying god could sustain an empire forever." They left me there, alone in that ancient conference room, with my data slates and my certainty, and the crushing weight of what I now knew. I sat there for hours, unable to move, unable to think, just staring at the walls and feeling the structure of my entire reality crumble around me. The next day, I returned to my cubicle and continued my work. What else could I do? I compiled my reports. I tracked the numbers. I watched faith die, percentage point by percentage point, and I documented it all with the meticulous care of a man preserving evidence for a trial that would never come. The collapse accelerated. Within 2 years of that meeting, prayer attendance on my hive world had dropped below 10%. The Grand Cathedral closed permanently. Most of the smaller parishes simply ceased to function, their priests dead or fled or converted into something else. Community organizers, administrators, sometimes just forgotten. The Imperial Creed was still taught in the Schola, still broadcast on the public Vox channels, still enforced by the Arbites when necessary. But it was empty ritual now, words without meaning, a corpse propped up and made to dance by an administratum too paralyzed to admit it was dead. And the Astronomican continued to dim. More ships were lost. More worlds fell into isolation. I received reports from navigator houses of seeing things in the warp that had not been there before, or rather, seeing nothing where the Emperor's light had once blazed. The darkness was growing, and humanity was stumbling into it blind. I began to understand, in those final years, what I was really witnessing. Faith in the Emperor had never been about love or devotion or spiritual truth. It had been about survival. The Emperor's psychic presence, channeled through the Astronomican and reinforced by the belief of quadrillions of human souls, had been the glue holding humanity together across the vast gulf of space. It had been the lighthouse keeping the warp at bay, the barrier between reality and the things that hungered in the darkness. And now, that barrier was failing, not because humanity had chosen to abandon the Emperor, but because the Emperor was abandoning humanity not through malice or intent, but simply through the slow erosion of 10,000 years of constant, agonizing sacrifice. The Imperium was built on suffering. The Emperor's suffering on the Golden Throne. The suffering of the billions of psychers fed to him daily to sustain his existence. The suffering of the faithful who believed their prayers meant something. And now all that suffering was being revealed as insufficient, as unable to hold back the inevitable tide of entropy and death. We had built our civilization on the promise that faith would save us, that the Emperor would protect us, that our devotion would be rewarded with survival. And now we were learning that promises mean nothing to the universe, that no amount of faith can hold back the fundamental truth that all things end. I stopped going to my cubicle eventually. There was no point. The administratum was collapsing from within, its structures hollowed out by the loss of the faith that had animated them. My superiors stopped sending orders. The tithes stopped flowing. The great machine of bureaucracy ground to a halt, not with a catastrophic failure, but with a slow winding down, like a clock running out of spring tension. I spent my days wandering the hive, watching humanity continue to live and work and struggle, even as the structures that had governed their existence for millennia crumbled around them. And I realized something that perhaps should have been obvious from the beginning. Humanity would survive the death of the Emperor. Not as an Imperium, not as a unified species spanning the galaxy, but as small, isolated communities, individual worlds or systems or habitats, each finding their own way through the darkness. The Imperium had convinced us that we needed it to survive, that without the Emperor and his church and his administratum, we would be helpless prey for the Xenos and the Chaos Gods and the infinite dangers of the universe. But I saw, in the gangers of the Underhive who had never needed the Emperor to survive, in the factory workers who continued to produce even without the blessing of the Mechanicus, in the families who loved and raised children and found meaning in their brief lives without any reference to the Golden Throne, that humanity was more resilient than the Imperium had ever admitted. We would survive. But we would survive as something new, something the architects of the Imperium would not recognize, something that might, in time, build its own civilizations, and its own faiths, and its own myths. And perhaps, millennia from now, someone would uncover the records I had compiled, the documentation of faith's slow death, and they would understand that what they thought was the end was really just a transformation. The last time I saw the Aquila, the true Aquila, not the tarnished icons that still hung in forgotten shrines, was in a dream. I was standing in that empty cathedral again, but this time I was not alone. The pews were filled with people. But they were not praying. They were simply sitting, watching me, waiting. And at the altar, where the statue of the Emperor had stood, there was nothing, just empty space. Just air and light and possibility. I walked down the aisle toward that emptiness, and as I walked, I felt something I had not felt in years. Not faith, I was long past faith. Not hope. Hope was a luxury for those who still believed the future could be shaped by wanting it badly enough. But something else, something quieter and more fundamental. Acceptance, perhaps, or simply understanding. The knowledge that I had witnessed something that had needed to be witnessed, that I had documented something that had needed to be documented, and that whatever came next would come whether I approved or not. When I reached the altar, I looked back at the congregation, and I saw that they were no longer sitting in pews. They were standing, moving, walking past me toward the great doors of the cathedral. They were leaving, not in anger or fear or desperation, just leaving, because they had somewhere else to be, something else to do. The service was over. The cathedral was empty, and the universe continued its slow turning, indifferent to the prayers of humanity, indifferent to our faith, or our doubt, or our desperate need for meaning. I watched them go, one by one, until I was alone in that vast space. And then I left too, walking out into a world where the Emperor was dying, and humanity was learning to live without him. The records I compiled are stored in an archival vault, deep in the Administratum Tower, sealed behind layers of encryption and security protocols. They will survive the collapse, I think. They will be found, eventually, by someone who wants to understand how this happened. And when they read them, they will see the numbers, the graphs, the meticulous documentation of faith's erosion. They will see the testimonies of priests and workers and administrators like me, all of us watching the same slow catastrophe unfold from different angles. But I wonder if they will understand what those numbers really mean. I wonder if they will comprehend that what we lost was not just belief in the Emperor, but belief in the idea that our suffering had meaning, that our devotion could shape reality, that faith was anything more than a story we told ourselves to make the darkness bearable. The Imperium taught us that we mattered, that humanity was special, that the Emperor watched over us and cared about our struggles. And when that teaching proved false, not because it was malicious, but simply because it could not sustain itself forever, we were left with nothing but ourselves. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it has to be enough, because the alternative is to admit that we cannot survive without a dying God to prop us up. And I refuse to believe that about humanity. We are stronger than our faith. We are more than our devotion. We will endure, even if the Imperium does not. Even if the Emperor does not, even if everything we built crumbles into dust. I am old now. My eyes are failing, my hands shake, my body is giving out in the way all bodies eventually do. I will not live to see the end. I will not witness the final collapse of the Imperium or the last dimming of the Astronomican. But I have seen enough to know how the story ends. Not with fire and fury, not with heroic last stands or redemptive sacrifices, but with a slow, quiet fading, a gradual winding down, until one day humanity looks up and realizes the light has gone out, and we are standing alone in the darkness, and then we will light new fires. We will build new lights. We will create new stories to give meaning to our existence. And perhaps, if we are wise, we will not make gods of those lights. We will not sacrifice everything to sustain them. We will remember that lights, like all things, are temporary, and that the darkness is not our enemy but simply the background against which we define ourselves. This is what I have learned. This is what I have documented. This is the truth that the Imperium could never acknowledge. Faith is not eternal, gods are not immortal, and humanity's survival has never depended on either. It depends only on our willingness to continue, to adapt, to find new ways to be human, even when the old ways have failed us. The Emperor is dying. The Imperium is dying. Faith is dying. And we will live on anyway, because that is what humanity does. We survive. We endure. We persist, even in the face of truths that should break us. And perhaps, in that persistence, we will find something more honest than faith, more sustainable than devotion, more real than the lies we told ourselves for 10,000 years. I was there when the prayers stopped. And I am here now, at the end, documenting what comes after. Not for glory, not for remembrance, but simply because someone needed to bear witness to the death of faith and the birth of whatever comes next. The universe turns, the darkness spreads, and humanity, faithless and godless, and finally, terribly free, walks forward into an uncertain future with nothing but itself to rely upon. That is what happens when humanity abandons the Emperor. Or, perhaps more accurately, that is what happens when the Emperor abandons humanity, and we are forced to discover that we never needed him as much as we thought we did. The records are sealed. The story is told. And I am done.